Week 30, I have restarted the effort. I have restarted the development process again. This was a difficult decision, and to put things in context, before last week, I had a working product with a nice happy path. The user could download my app, install it, go through the normal user process, and it would work. It would work well, and there was no errors and issues in that particular path. However, when I was doing bug squashing, when I was going through the app and testing it, noting the issues that I found, as I was doing that, I discovered that the more bugs I squashed, the more bugs emerged. And that led to a horrible realization that the shortcuts that I took to get the app to a point where it can be released in that state were really technical debt. There's no better way of describing it. And we all know debt. You always pay a lot more back to the creditor than you initially borrow from the creditor. So I was paying great dividends, I suppose, to the god of bad architecting and bad testing. I realized that I was spending a lot more time fixing the bugs than, for instance, fixing some occasional bugs in a well-architected, well-tested app. So the difficult decision was made that I archived my old repo and I started a new one. So last week I spent most of my time paving the most robust foundation I can think of for my particular app. And I think that, I suppose in a way I could say that the previous 29 weeks of development effort was wasted. Yeah, sure. That's one way of looking at it. And, some might say that that's, I suppose, the only way of looking at it. However, I do think that I learned a lot of important lessons from the previous 29 weeks, and that the tuition I paid into it could probably save me loads of time down the line. So, what did I do last week to pave the most robust foundation for this app that's different than before? The biggest difference that I made in this particular setup is that I made sure that I will stick to a very strict and disciplined approach for test-driven development. I have put in consist rules, as well as kt-lint and detect, but these are not the important one for test-driven development. I've put in consist rules, KONSIST, consist rules, to enforce a very high level of test coverage and test quality. I want my business logic to meet 95% test coverage, and I want the rest of the components to meet 90%. This is extremely high, even for modern app standards, and probably on par with test-driven development efforts. So in other words, I made sure to put the consist rules in a pre-commit hook. In other words, I can't even commit without putting in the tests first. I want to make sure that I set up the safeguards to prevent myself from being stupid. So consist rules are there to enforce architectural decisions, architectural adherence to prevent drift, in addition to test-driven development. So I'm going to stick to a very strict structure of clean architecture. I'm not going to omit the domain layer anymore. I'm not going to stuff that logic in my view model or in my repository. There is going to be a domain layer, and that domain layer is going to be tested to death. So that's consist tests. And of course, I also included kt-lint as well as detect for style situations and code formatting issues. I want the code to be easy to read, both by humans as well as by AI coding agents. I also enforced, a lot of formatting rules that were broken in my previous repo. For instance, a file cannot have they have a maximum length, maximum number of classes. Classes have inheritance limits, and all those, I suppose, standard things that you would do a KT lint as well as detect. So in other words, the safeguards that I've set up would prevent me from doing stupid things in the app just so that I can push some features out. And more importantly, it would also prevent the AI coding agent that I've been using from doing the same thing. Now, the temptation, of course, is always that you can bypass those. You can say no verify in your commit message. I'll try not to do that. We'll see how that goes. But I'll try not to do that, because if I keep doing that, if I keep relaxing the rules, I will probably drift back into the old problem habit again that resulted in the sorry situation of the previous repo. In addition to those pre-commit hooks, I also implemented pre-push hooks where a full suite of tests, the entire repository tests, will be run locally, as well as the build verification to make sure that the project compiles before it even reaches the remote repository. In other words, the code that I commit and push from my computer would be in the most pristine condition ever. And I cannot afford to make the same mistake again. After this experience, I can definitely appreciate sort of the rules and regulations set forth by the platform teams in any big organizations. I remember being very annoyed by detect and KT lint rules in my previous work. And I was like, why this import ordering, who cares so long as stuff is there? And I think that now I do understand, I do care, and people do care. And those folks who work on the architecture level things, they do care. And I do too. So pre-commit hooks, pre-push hooks, and on top of that, in my repository, I set up the GitHub Actions to run a full suite of tests, unit tests, integration tests, style checks, KT-lint, and everything that are run locally in the repository environment. In other words, there will be double checks, both locally as well as in the build environment, the CI/CD environment. There can be no mistakes. There can be no errors. Then last week, what I also did was I set up, just like before, I set up the automatic upload to Google Play Store. And that happens in the CI/CD environment within GitHub. So as soon as I upload a build, that's the other important thing that I'll have to talk about, which is I switched from the Git Flow workflow to a trunk-based development flow. But anyway, so the building, signing, and uploading of the program files to Google Play Store is, as expected, the same as before, automated in the CI/CD environment in GitHub. Now, I started iOS development as well, and one of the goals for the second round of development is that I want to keep all platforms on the same level. In other words, I develop for all platforms at the same time. I don't want to do Android first and then forget about iOS until later, because one of the issues that I discovered previously was that the stubs that I left in the iOS development environment, if you will, became so overwhelming that I lost the will to implement the stubs. So instead of doing that, I would just take it one step at a time, build features more slowly, but make sure that all the features can run on all platforms before I proceed to the next set of features. And earlier I mentioned that I switched from Git Flow to trunk-based development. This is interesting. I had to do research on trunk-based development because Git Flow seems to be the one that's been prevailing for quite a long time. What Git Flow is repository management, right? You have the master branch that represents the released products, and then you have the develop branch where all the new features are being pushed to. And different teams would develop different features, on their feature branches, and then those commits and pull requests can be gigantic. You can have a gigantic feature branch development in a pull request that's like dozens of files, and then once the feature finishes development, they then merge those features onto the development branch. But of course, as you can imagine, dozens of files would take a long time to develop, even by the most proficient teams. So between the point that they checked out the code from develop branch to the time that they are ready for a PR review, a lot of things might have changed on the development branch, and ideally they would want to merge develop back into their feature branch to make sure that their feature branch continues to work. But in practice, a lot of times this would introduce a lot of conflicts, especially for gigantic products. So I was using that, and for me, it's not really conflict is not really a big problem because I'm the only person who's making commits, and I don't really foresee myself having that problem and for a long, long time, if that would become a problem at all. But this Git Flow adds a lot of overhead for a solo developer. In addition to that, it also adds a lot of complexity for build versioning management. So because different feature branches might have different builds, and different feature branches might be pulling from develop branch at different times, you could conceivably and not conceivably very easily have a situation where the build with a lower build number actually has a more recent code base than the build with a higher build number. And this is just not intuitive at all, and it can create a lot of confusion, and it's just a lot of headache. So with these issues in mind, the solution to that is the new kid on the block, trunk-based development, TBD. What a great acronym. In essence, you get rid of the develop branch. You don't worry about develop branch at all. You make very small atomic, they're not really atomic because we're talking atomic is a process description, but you make very small commits to the master branch. But critically, every commit has to be build verified. In other words, no commit can break build. No commit can cause issues on a master branch. The master branch is a living, breathing trunk, and everybody just commits, small commits directly to master branch, which is like crazy. Like, how can you do that? And that's why a lot of safeguards have to be in place. In other words, all the pre-commit, pre-push hooks have to be in place. The code has to be pristine before it reaches the CI/CD environment in your repository. In addition to that, once it reaches your repository, the repository needs to run its own CI/CD on the cloud before it allows the merge to take place. In essence, it's sort of doing a mini pull request every time when anybody commits something to the master branch. So what this means is that the history is linear, right? You don't have a gigantic feature that takes 2 weeks to merge onto the master branch. And if you have something that really would have to take a couple files and maybe an entire day to work on, you can make a pull request, but the rule is, of course, you merge those pull requests on the same day, and you don't let it set overnight. This most stringent implementation actually has automated cleanup. In other words, every night after people go home, a GitHub action would run and get rid of all the PRs that were old, that were created that day. In other words, if you didn't manage to merge the PR request, you're going to have to do it again the next day. So trunk-based development, I think its simplicity definitely is a boon to me. And so far, within the last couple of days, we're working using that process. I feel pretty inspired. I think this can help me in terms of reducing the overhead when it comes to infrastructure side of things. So yeah, big decision to redevelop, but I think it's a boon. It's a blessing in disguise, and I'm putting in all the safeguards, the rails for myself. as well as changing the development process to trunk-based development. So let's hope that this can be interesting. So next week is going to be, I think, I haven't decided yet. I think it's going to be implementing the scaffolding for the architecture. In other words, if I wanted clean architecture to be in place, I needed to put the layers in place. And I think I'll do that before I do the initial UI storyboarding. So that would be next week, putting in clean architecture scaffolding, as well as MVI Orbit for the model view intent state management library. And that would be a tall order, but I think if I can manage that. Anyways, that's it for this week. I'll see you next week.